New revelations reignite the Pachamama case. Leo XIV, then a missionary, allegedly participated in a ceremony with an offering to the earth and knelt. A bishop intervened in his defense. But there are times when a defense doesn't help to quell a scandal, but ends up making it even bigger. This is what is happening these days, because while some are trying to clarify, elements are emerging that do not close the issue, but reopen it on an even deeper level. It all started with a specific episode dating back to 1995. A young missionary, Robert Prevost, today known as Leo XIV, participated in a theological ecological congress in Latin America. A context that, taken alone, would be unproblematic. But within that context, a ceremony linked to the so-called Pachamama, Mother Earth, takes place, and this is precisely the crux of the entire case. Bishop Reynaldo Nan intervenes and tries to defend Leo XIV from the accusations. His words are clear. There was no idolatry, no worship, but immediately after comes the passage that changes everything, because Nan himself admits that the young Prevost participated in that ceremony and that during that moment he knelt. And this is where the issue ceases to be marginal. It's no longer a question of a passive presence, nor of a misunderstanding, but of a precise, concrete gesture, recognized even by the defense. Kneeling in the Catholic tradition is not a neutral gesture. It is an act that carries with it a precise meaning, linked to prayer, adoration, the recognition of something that surpasses man. The defense tries to explain. They say that intention matters, that a gesture of prayer isn't automatically adoration, and that kneeling doesn't necessarily mean worship. But this explanation, instead of closing the case, moves it onto even more delicate ground, because it introduces a principle that raises many more questions than it answers. If everything depends on intention, then any gesture can be reinterpreted, even those that traditionally have a specific meaning. And in fact, the defense goes further. It doesn't simply deny idolatry, but proposes a completely different reading of Pachamama. Not a divinity, but the soul of the earth, a reality that can be seen as a creature of God. There's talk of a dialogue with the earth, an offering to the earth, a cultural, not a religious gesture, and an even more controversial element is added. One can kneel before this reality, just as one kneels before saints, as long as one doesn't consider it a goddess. This is where the issue inevitably becomes theological, because the boundary between symbol and cult, between cultural gesture and religious act, suddenly becomes blurred. And when that boundary becomes blurred, the question is no longer what one wanted to do, but what one actually did. This episode, which could be dismissed as a fact of the past, is however linked to something much more recent, namely the Pachamama case of 2019 during the pontificate of Pope Francis. There, too, cultural symbols were discussed, representations of life and motherhood, and the idea of idolatry was also ruled out. Today's defense follows a very similar line. No cult, no adoration, only misinterpretations. But it is precisely this parallelism that for some observers represents the most critical point. No longer isolated incidents, but a coherent line. No longer occasional ambiguities, but a vision that tends to redefine the relationship between the Catholic faith and cultural symbols. And it is in this context that James Altman's words, spoken during an interview with LifeSite News, come into play. His words don't simply comment on the case, but place it within a much broader and more radical context. According to Altman, the problem is not that people are abandoning the Catholic Church. The distinction he makes is very precise. What they are distancing themselves from, he says, is a false church, professed, preached, and practiced by false pastors who present themselves as priests, bishops, and even popes. It is not the true church that is being rejected, but a distortion of it. Speaking directly about the Pachamama issue, Altman uses extremely harsh words. He calls what happened in the Vatican in 2019 the worship of a pagan idol and connects it to what is emerging today about Leo XIV's past. The crux of his argument is very clear. If someone commits such an act and does not openly reject it, then he has not really rejected it. Altman insists on a principle he repeats several times: either you are for Christ or you are against Christ. And in this scheme, the Pachamama is not a neutral symbol, but something that stands in opposition. For this reason, according to him, explaining or reinterpreting isn't enough. A clear condemnation is needed. He then arrives at an even stronger statement. If a priest, bishop, or anyone else were to participate in such a rite and kneel before a pagan symbol, he should be removed and punished. And he applies the same criterion to the highest levels of the hierarchy. Another central point of his speech concerns silence. Altman openly criticizes the fact that many within the church remain silent. And it introduces a very clear idea. Failing to oppose an obvious error is, in effect, tolerating it. Silence in this context is not neutrality, but complicity. According to him, the current crisis is not just a matter of individual episodes, but concerns the loss of clarity about what is true and what is not. And when this clarity is lacking, people don't necessarily abandon their faith, but they distance themselves from what they perceive as inconsistent. At this point, the conflict is clear. On one side, there are those who maintain that these are cultural gestures, misinterpreted, devoid of idolatrous content. On the other hand, there are those who see in those gestures a clear break, the crossing of a limit that should not be crossed. And it all comes back to the same simple, yet impossible to ignore point. A man who is now Pope, in a specific context, during a ceremony that speaks of an offering to the earth, kneels. This fact, confirmed even by those who defend him, remains at the center of everything. You can debate the intention, you can debate the language, you can debate the cultural context, but the gesture remains, and with it, the question remains. If it wasn't worship, then what was it really? And perhaps this is where the entire case hinges. Not in the photo, not in the past, but in the answer that still remains unresolved. Because until that answer arrives, the issue isn't closed. It remains open and continues to grow. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment, Amen. God bless you.